And I'm very pleased and honored to have two distinguished speakers with us. I introduce them immediately. Professor Neil Ferguson. Professor Ferguson is Milbank Family Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, Stanford University, and Dr. David Van Wil, who is Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges of the NATO. So let me start from Professor Ferguson. Thank you very much to both of you, of course, for joining us today. Professor Ferguson, you have voiced concern about both the US regime change plans for Russia and the effects of sanctions, which could go, inverted commas, terribly wrong. So what else should the Biden administration do to stop Putin's war? Please, Professor Ferguson.
Well, thank you very much indeed for inviting me to participate in this conference. Let's just be clear to begin with that this war can keep going beyond the summer because from a historian's point of view, the longer a war lasts, the longer it lasts, it gets harder to stop. There was a piece of research done back in the 1990s that looked at a sample of wars from 1816 to 1985. The average war lasted 15 months. Now, there were quite a few, about half the sample, that lasted less than 6 months, and indeed a quarter lasted less than 2, but close to a quarter lasted more than 2 years. And we don't know how long this war will last. It's been going now for 4 months, very nearly. Many people at the outset thought it would last a matter of days or weeks. And I think it's very important to remind your audience that wars tend not to last just weeks. The other thing that I want to say at the beginning is that if you protract the war, if the war keeps going, of course you protract the loss of life in Ukraine. President Zelensky recently acknowledged for the first time how high the casualties are on the Ukrainian side. You protract the destruction of the country's infrastructure, and you also protract the disruption of the global food supply, not to mention the European energy supply. And that adds to an already very serious inflation problem around the world. Price of oil's up 46% since before the war. Wheat's up 40% since before the war. We're looking at the possibility of famine in parts of East Africa, and I think a very grave energy crisis in Europe next winter. Anyone who thinks time is on Ukraine's side doesn't understand the role of what I've called the attention deficit disorder of American foreign policy. American aid to Ukraine thus far totals up to $50 billion. Is that going to be forthcoming in the second half of this year? What about the first half of next year? I think the question answers itself. Now, my concerns, of course, predated the outbreak of war, and I've been arguing for some time that it was very risky to keep NATO membership for Ukraine on the table in theory, when in practice it was never going to happen. And then at the same time, not to arm Ukraine before this war sufficiently to deter Russian aggression. After the war began, and that was something that I predicted consistently from the beginning of the year, I understood the initial Western response, which was, of course, to prevent Ukraine losing, and in particular to prevent Kyiv from falling. But it's got steadily harder for me to understand what the strategy is in the wake of the Russian failure to win the Battle of Kyiv. And I don't understand why there has not been a more serious American attempt to broker a ceasefire and try to get the fighting to stop. Why has the US left others to attempt negotiations when only the US has the power to force both sides to the negotiating table, as it is the principal supplier of weapons to Ukraine and the principal imposer of sanctions on Russia? I think the best point of comparison here is the Arab-Israeli War of 1973, which the US did intervene to stop, having kept Israel in the war with significant weapons deliveries. The then National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger swiftly acted to bring that war to a stop. Correction Secretary of State at that point. And the negotiations there, I think, were a model of what you do in a situation like this. There was no question that the Arab states were the aggressors, but Kissinger understood that allowing Israel to inflict a complete and humiliating defeat on them was not really in the interests of long-term stability. And a process was began that ultimately produced a peace. I think there has to be, and Kissinger said this himself at Davos just a few weeks ago, some explicit discussion of what a realistic end state looks like for this war. Is it the status quo ante of February the 23rd? I don't think it's realistic to imagine going back to 2014 and restoring Crimea to Ukraine. I think I can imagine a process whereby sanctions relief is exchanged in return for Russian troop withdrawals from the Donbass and the southeast of Ukraine. But I think we also need to start talking much more openly about what security guarantees we are going to peace agreement is reached. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. You mentioned a war which could last for a while, for months, maybe even more. And in this process, the West is increasingly isolating Russia. So my question is, in your opinion, what is the long-lasting effect of this isolation, or this attempt to isolate Russia on Russia itself and on Putin's regime?
There's a lot of inertia in sanctions as a tool of statecraft. Think of how long they were imposed by the United States on Cuba, on Iran after 1979, on Syria, on North Korea, on Venezuela. The US has a habit of imposing sanctions on regimes it considers to be rogue regimes and then kind of forgetting about them. And then it takes a while for anybody to make the argument for reducing or relieving the sanctions. So I think it's reasonable to assume that unless there is a regime change in Russia, or unless there's an unexpected breakthrough in negotiations to end the war, these sanctions will stay in place for not just months, but years. Now, I should add that I don't think that there is likely to be regime change in Russia. There were moments when it seemed as if the Biden administration thought that might happen. Indeed, Joe Biden let slip in a speech in Warsaw that he wanted to see Putin removed from power. I have to say, I think the Grim Reaper of mortality is more likely to do that than any political change inside Russia. And so it's a mistake, I think, to base policy on the idea that there's going to be a political change in Moscow. We shouldn't delude ourselves that Russia won't find another market for its oil. It's already replaced Saudi Arabia as China's biggest supplier. There are other buyers for Russian oil in the world, even if Europe entirely ceases to purchase energy from Russia. The really impactful sanctions turn out to be the ones that have cut Russia, in particular Russian industry, off from advanced semiconductors and other imported components. These have already had the effect of cutting off the supply of new and sophisticated weaponry, so that Russia is increasingly forced to wage a 20th century war with 20th century weaponry because it can't actually manufacture any 21st century weaponry. That's important, and I think it also imposes a real freeze on Russia's economic potential, condemning Russia, in effect, to economic stagnation. But that's not something that necessarily ends the war. The problem is that Russia can grind out a victory of sorts, perhaps a Pyrrhic victory, using 20th century technology, provided it's got more of it than Ukraine does, and provided it can win a war of attrition, given the finite supplies of trained military manpower in Ukraine. I think if I'm right, what happens, therefore, is that Russia's increasingly driven closer to China and becomes primarily a source of raw materials for China. And that would signify really the tightest, closest relationship between Russia and China that we've seen since the time of the Korean War, except that the roles have been reversed, because back in 1950, the Soviet Union, Russia was the senior partner and China was very much the junior partner. Now, China is the senior partner and of course, Russia is very much the junior partner. I think this is an extremely important dimension from the point of view of the United States as well as Europe. We must bear in mind that implicitly, if not explicitly, Xi Jinping gave a green light to Putin to go ahead with his so-called special military operation, as long as he waited until after the Beijing Winter Olympics. I'm sure this was a tremendous blunder on the part of the Chinese government, but the outcome is a not wholly undesirable one from China's point of view if it's going to be able to get Russian resources at a discount, which effectively is what has already begun to happen.
Thank you very much, Professor Ferguson. You mentioned the membership, the potential membership of Ukraine to the NATO, which was not on the table or should not be on the table. So let me turn this question to Dr. Van Wil. Dr. Van Wil, previous and future NATO enlargements may reinforce the rhetoric of Russia and all those who see this as a risk for international security. How to respond to these concerns, and where is NATO heading after the Ukraine war? Please.
Thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation. And I have to correct you that I'm not a doctor. I didn't go to school that long. But okay. I'm honored to be able to speak to such a studied audience.
We are at the Bocconi University, so I can say honoris causa.
Well, thank you very much for that honorary title for today. Let me begin by stating that NATO never wanted this war. There was only one party that wanted this war, and it was Putin. And it's been on his mind for a long, long time. NATO has done everything we can to avoid this war. We've even held the NATO-Russia councils. We've looked at their proposals for future treaties, which were completely unacceptable. We've tried to keep the dialogue going. Nonetheless, Putin invaded Ukraine on the 24th of February, and here we are. At that time, in response, NATO said that if Putin wanted less NATO on his doorstep, then probably he was on his way to achieve the opposite. And we've seen with the applications now of Sweden and Finland that prophecy has turned out to be true. The reason these countries want to join NATO is because they feel that they need this security arrangement for their own safety. They've seen Russia invade a sovereign neighbor against previous agreements in. So NATO enlargement never posed a threat to Russian sovereignty. NATO is a defensive organization, but we do believe that countries have the sovereign right to choose their own security arrangements, and therefore in the Washington Treaty, the open door has been made explicit. That will not change. It will not change due to what Putin has done now, and I think that the accession, hopefully soon accession of Sweden and Finland will be a proof that NATO provides security to all its members, and its door remains open for those nations that wish to join this security arrangement. That is a fact that Putin, but also Russia, will have to live with. And as was stated at multiple times, a lot of our effort now is based on trying to avoid this conflict from spilling over into NATO territory. That's why we will defend and deter every inch of Allied territory, why we've put 40,000 troops on the eastern border under command of the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, why hundreds of aircraft are in the air, and why hundreds of ships are at sea now, to make very, very clear that NATO territory is very much off limits in this conflict and to President Putin.
Thank you very much. There is one aspect of warfare which is sometimes underestimating, and that is cybersecurity, cyberspace, which is and will be of key importance in modern conflicts. How ready are NATO members to respond to malicious actions in the cyberspace?
Well, that's a very broad question, and I can only give you a very broad answer. Sometimes since the 24th of February, people tell to me that this conflict shows that modern day conflict is very much still about artillery and tanks and aircrafts and missiles, and not so much about the new 21st century threats like cyber or the use of EDTs in conflict. But that's not true. In this conflict, cyber was used to shape the battlefield in the months before the attack. It was used during the attack, trying to disrupt communications on the Ukrainian side, trying to get the financial systems, electricity systems offline, and it's still continuing to play a large role at this moment in the conflict. So all efforts from the Russian side are now based on disrupting all cyber-related aspects of Ukrainian life. And it's only due to the great resistance and resilience that Ukraine has shown that they've been able to keep their services online. And I have to say that the private sector, and especially companies like Microsoft, but also Starlink, by providing communication terminals, have played a large role in trying to keep us safe. So there's lessons to be learned here, and we are certainly beginning to learn those also for NATO itself and for NATO allies, and that is that we have to be prepared for cyber attacks to take place in conjunction with conventional attacks should such a conflict begin. And that we need to work on our resilience of our systems in order to make sure that, just like Ukraine, we can ride out these kinds of attacks, as Ukraine is also defending itself against conventional attacks. So very much something to be worked on. We have done a lot, but more to be done in light of this conflict.
Thank you very much. So thanks a lot to Professor Ferguson. Thanks a lot to Mr. Van Wiel. Now we stop here for this part with our two keynote speakers. And now I leave the floor to Andrea Cabrini to moderate the panel discussion of this session. Thank you again to both of you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think we had a really remarkable, and I even say memorable, kickoff of our Global Policy Forum. Now we do have a lot on the table to discuss. We're going to do this in 3 different panels and some keynote speeches before the closing remarks of the Secretary General of the OECD, Matthias Cormann. And the starting point of our discussion today is the buzzword. You heard it from Commissioner Paolo Gentiloni. The invasion of Russia in Ukraine is a game changer, not just of the international security architecture, but we already heard about the severe shortages in fuel and food, of the refugee, the humanitarian crisis, and what the international community can do, trying to restore not just peace, but also to mitigate the impact of this crisis. This is what we're going to discuss here on the Bocconi stage with Oksana Pokalchuk. Welcome. She is the director of Amnesty International in Ukraine, a lawyer, a human rights activist. It's a pleasure having you here in Milan. And Thomas Gomart, who's director of the French Institute of International Relations, Ghassan Salameh, professor of international relations at Sciences Po, and he was the previous senior advisor of the Secretary General of the United Nations. And Susan Shirk. Susan Shirk is chair of the 21st Century China Center of the University of California in San Diego. So let me start in terms of the international community, its role. Ghassan Salameh, my first point is for you, because when we think at the player on the ground, not just from a military standpoint, but from a diplomatic standpoint, the main forces, where is the United Nations? We know that the Security Council is kind of stalled today, but do you think that it could have some space in the future to maneuver, to be one of the players of the solution of this crisis?
No, very frankly, I don't think so. It has been the case since the creation of the United Nations in 1945 that when a member of the P5, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, has been directly involved in a conflict, it was almost impossible for the Security Council itself to get involved because the veto would be raised immediately by the country concerned. This was the case during the colonial wars with Britain and France. This was the case with Russia in different places, including Georgia and Ukraine in 2014, and was the case also with China when it came to Tibet. So when a P5 member, when a veto-yielding power is involved, the Security Council is paralyzed. This time, on top of that, the Secretary General was himself paralyzed. Putin would not meet him in Beijing on the margin of the Olympics. Zelensky was not very happy either. Putin would take time in order to receive him along this huge table, like other visitors he had. He was not very kind to him. So neither the Security Council nor the Secretary General were in a good position to start negotiations. What we do? My advice is what I call to maintain and contain. First, to contain. We need to contain the Ukraine war in itself and for itself. The Security Council cannot do much about it. The Secretary General cannot do much about it, but let's contain it. Let's not have it infect the whole international system and the other conflicts. Let's contain it as much as we can in what it is, so that the Security Council, especially with countries that are now associated, like Russia and China, can still operate on other formula, other conflicts, appointing special representative of the Security Council, including one to succeed me in Libya, or to succeed my colleague in Afghanistan, who's leaving this week, trying to find a number of agreements on other conflicts that are, in particular, I would say, we need a Security Council resolution to keep feeding the 3 or 4 million refugees in northwest Syria. And for that, we need to cooperate with the Chinese and the Russians on that. Yeah. So my proposal, let's contain the Ukrainian conflict despite its huge importance, and let's maintain cooperation with China and Russia on other things that are not related directly to Ukraine, where the Security Council can do little.
Contain and maintain, these are the first keywords we are hearing here. But Thomas Commart, we already also saw on our video clip introducing the debate, Russia is kind of a pariah state today. With the invasion, Putin has isolated completely Russia from the international community, and also from an economic standpoint. We already heard today all the consequences of this. How do you look at the future of the relation between Europe and Russia, if there will be a kind of a formal relation in the future?
First of all, let me thank ISPI and University Bocconi and OECD for their kind invitation. It's a real pleasure to be with you this afternoon. To go to your question, I would like maybe to remind that this war did not started, on the 24th of February. This war started 8 years ago with the annexation of Crimea and the separatists directly supported by Moscow 8 years ago. And sanctions were taken already by the EU at that time. So it's important to have this timeline in mind, to try to anticipate what could happen in the coming months or years. At the time being, the main consequences are for sure, first of all, for Ukraine, which suffers dramatically from casualties. It's now a broken country to some extent. The situation for Russia is the fact that Russia has been disconnected from the Western side of globalization. The point is that there are other sides of globalization. And for Europe, the main consequence is the fact that Europe, as a continent, lost its main competitive advantage, which was a peaceful continent by comparison with other regions in the world. So that leads indeed to a few observations regarding the current situation between the EU and Russia. I started my career at ISPI already 2 decades ago, and I spent many times to cover, for instance, the summit between the EU and Russia. I remind you that we had 2 summits each year until 2014, until the annexation of Crimea. I remind, a lecture at the College of Europe in Gimo, for instance. So that's unfortunately the past now, because I think that Russia, as I said, is disconnected for many years, for the next decade, at least, I would say. It's not a situation similar to the one we had during the Cold War, for 2 main reasons. During the Cold War, there was a confrontation, which was ideological and a military competition. But you had, during the Cold War, intellectual, scientific, cultural links, which was, by the way, promoted, encouraged by the West to try to make the USSR and its allies changing. And the big change is in fact that we are in a worse situation right now, because we are in a military confrontation, we are in an ideological confrontation, but we cut all types of links. I think it's explained by the magnitude of the Russian aggression, but also the magnitude of the sanctions taken to react will continue for a while, as it was said rightly, I think, during the first decision. The problem we have is in fact that the Kremlin, the current leadership in the Kremlin, Vladimir Vladimirovich, does think that the EU will be on its knees before Russia. That's mainly the calculus made in the Kremlin. And more broadly, Russia is preparing itself since many years, and in a sense it was before 2014, for a world of autarky. You have this idea in Russia that the pressure on resources, the competition between powers will increase dramatically, and consequently, Russia should be able to have a much more autarkic economy or system. That's the Kremlin's choice. It can be seen as completely misleading from a Western point of view for people who believe so strongly into globalization, but that's basically the orientation taken by the Kremlin since many years, and which has been accelerated with this war in Ukraine. Last point, I think that the dramatic, the main consequence at the time being between the EU and Russia is related to the inversion of the energy model. To put things very bluntly, Italy started to import, oil from USSR in 1958. Europeans take gas from the USSR at the beginning of the 80s, and our energy system was basically to take energy resources from the East and from the global South. And now, in a very short period of time, we are asked as Europeans to invest the model, and to take energy from the West, from the US, which is now a net exporter of energy, and from the global source. And it will be very, very difficult to accomplish that, given, the economic crisis, the environmental crisis, and for sure the military crisis. I stop there.
And it is difficult indeed. Now, let me, Oksana Pogoch, let me get back to Ukraine and the situation on the ground, because in his address, President Zelensky asked again to the European Union for weapons, for finance support, for starting to think at the rebuilding of the country. But which are, in your view, the most urgent needs of the people in Ukraine, based on what you do on the ground?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I'm Ukrainian myself, and our organization, we work from the very beginning of this full-scale war in Ukraine, so we investigate situation very closely from the ground, and it's hard to answer this question in short, but I would address two issues. First is the issue of basic needs. So a lot of people from eastern and south part of Ukraine, they were forced to leave their homes and flee into other regions inside Ukraine. In accordance with the UN, it's up to 7 million people who now are internally displaced people. So all of them, they need work, they need medical support, they need housing. Moreover, we have to raise the issue of IDPs who are in need and in poverty. And for them, the question of basic medicine might be the question of survive. So for all of these 7 million of people, the main question is winter. Because winter in Ukraine is cold. And now our government, they build temporary buildings for IDPs in Ukraine, but it's not enough. They don't have heating system. And the big question, where the 7 million of people will spend this winter. Second issue, of course, the question of security. Because every day, Ukrainian people suffering from rocket attacks and missiles from Russian territory and from territory of seas. I don't know if you saw it, I know we are not in the news now, but every day, every single day, we get attacks from Russia. And yeah, I think so far it's full.
Yeah, that's very interesting. We'll get back to that in a minute, because as you know, have been mentioned also the relation between Russia and China. With this, I want to move to Susan Shirk, because you know that Putin met with Xi Jinping ahead of the Winter Olympic. Now, Susan Shirk, do you think that he unveiled his plan to China a month before, ahead of starting the invasion? And why do you think that Xi Jinping, President Xi, is again sidelining and supporting in a way President Putin now?
Well, thank you so much to ISPI, Bocconi University, Think20 Indonesia, and the OECD for giving me the opportunity to participate, even though, unfortunately, I can't be there with you in person. Of course, we don't know what happened in the private conversation between Putin and Xi Jinping, but it's interesting that U.S. senior officials, Secretary of State Tony Blinken, gave Xi Jinping the benefit of the doubt when he said that he suspected that Putin had not revealed the full extent of his plans to invade the Ukraine, which of course gave Xi Jinping the opportunity to distance himself, to criticize the invasion, and to especially not support it. But instead, Xi Jinping opted to act as if Putin was his friend and the United States was his enemy, in that he very much sided with Putin, regardless of what he had actually been told. He didn't condemn the invasion. He didn't stand with Ukraine, which is one of China's major trading partners. But fortunately, he also did not tangibly assist Russia in its war in Ukraine, which as a practical matter, is probably the most important thing.
Thank you for that. I'll get back to Ghassan Salameh. And Ghassan Salameh, you've been also the UN Special Representative to Libya. You know very well the situation on the ground. And my question is, how do you see the implication of the war in the Middle East on one hand, with Syria, for example, and also in Libya and in the northern part of Africa?
Look, I don't believe that the difficulties the Russian aggression in Ukraine is encountering is going to affect in a radical way the Russian involvement elsewhere. Russia is very active in Syria, has been successful in protecting the regime of Bashar al-Assad, has been crucial since 2015 in doing that, and will be crucial in probably containing the Turkish attempt to create a cordon sanitaire on the border between Turkey and Syria, which Erdogan himself announced 2 weeks ago. In Libya, it's different. In Libya, in fact, the Russian mercenary company, Wagner, has been beaten by the Turkish army and by the western part of Libya, and they had to flee under a counterattack. Therefore, they had their difficulty. They also had difficulties in getting paid by Marshal Haftar. They also had difficulty in paying themselves their Syrian subcontractors, because they had brought 2,000 to 3,000 Syrian subcontractors to help them in Libya. So Wagner is having its own difficulties long before the Ukraine war has started. Now, it is also true that the whole world is now vying for those countries across the world, including in the Middle East, who are not aligned truly with neither Russia nor the West in this Ukrainian war. So both the West and Russia need the votes of those countries in the Middle East. The West in particular needs the gas and oil of this part of the world. And also they need money from the oil money-making countries in order to help those countries like Egypt, Lebanon, Senegal, who cannot pay for double price wheat because of the food crisis. And also you have the issue of refugees. While Western Europe has to deal with refugees from Ukraine, nobody in Europe wants a new wave of refugees across North Africa and in particular across Libya. Therefore, the centrality of the European theater, which has been the dogma of the Cold War and is still to a large extent a dogma, should not hide the fact that there are other conflicts in which Russia and China are directly involved, and they haven't stopped getting involved only because Russia is so involved in the Ukrainian war.
Thomas Kumar, what do you think that, having said that the UN is stalled, as Ghassan Salameh told us today, what can the international community do to accelerate a diplomatic solution, kind of a negotiate of the crisis? And what's the role that you think France, and it's also President Macron, it's a kind of a special day today after the vote and the election. How do you see the role that France can play looking ahead?
Look, I think, that it will be very difficult at the time being to turn the tide, to be honest. I'm afraid that, it's only depend on the military situation on the field and the level of support, given to the Ukrainian people to continue their existential fight. In fact, we are facing, in my opinion, a colonial war led by Russia under a nuclear cover. So to respond directly to your question, this nuclear dimension is very present in the French mindset since 24th of February. I have no time to elaborate on that, but it is something very consistent to explain in the French policy. Now, two things to be avoided. Maybe the very first one is when you deal with Russia, Russia does not consider that diplomacy means the end of warfare. Russia combines all the time warfare and diplomacy. And in the West, we have this habitude to think that diplomacy, that means stopping warfare. So let's be very, very careful when we are speaking about diplomatic process regarding the situation on the ground. The second thing related to France, there was many attempts, you know, during the before 24th of February. Last week there is this trip made by the leaders from Romania, Italy, Germany, and France. I think that what is expected from France right now is maybe to continue to be consistent on three main points. The very first one is to remind that we are facing as Europeans a very deep and quick degradation of our neighborhood, of our joint neighborhood. And it is a point made by Paris since many years with different perception in other European capitals. Now we are all, I would say, on the same line. Second, I think it's very important for France to clarify and to say that we don't fight against the Russian people. We fight against Putin's regime, and we stand with Ukraine and with Ukrainian people. And last point, I think that what is expected from Paris, it is to consider that we need to prepare the next organization within the EU, with certainly the next phase of enlargements, but also to try to find ways to deal with countries which are candidate or countries which are not candidate to the EU, and to be able at the same time to interact with the US, but also without the US, because there is a huge ellipsis in our discussion, which is the US future positioning. Imagine the situation, you know, last February with Donald Trump in the White House, for instance.
Now, Oksana Pokalchuk, there's also another angle talking human rights, which is war crimes. And in May, there was the first trial for war crimes since the beginning of the invasion. How do you see the role that international courts could have to, to restore justice, and what could hamper the role of international courts looking ahead?
Good question. Yeah, first of all, I want to say that, in my opinion, the whole processes and mechanism have to be as comprehensive as possible. That's first of all. And it is important for all of us, to support the system and to support existing mechanism and to address the war crimes into that institutions. But what can hamper? I would rather address 2 points. First, and it's obvious that Russia will continue to, not to cooperate in this process. So they will reject to extradite suspects, people who are suspected or accused of war crimes or things like this, and these people will never face the justice. And it doesn't mean that we have to stop it and not to continue doing it, because it's a question of international justice, and it's a question for justice for innocent victims, innocent killed civilians in Ukraine, which are waiting for this moment when the decision will be taken. And the second and very important issue for me is what might hamper is inability for international community to develop strong judicial mechanism to address the question of crime of aggression itself. It's quite a new challenge for the whole system, world system, I know, and there's a lot of bureaucracy around it. And there are a lot of ways how we can decide or how Ukraine can go, which might be seen much more easier. But the idea, I think now for all of us, and the biggest challenge for all of us is now that it's a moment when all of us, we can develop a strong new institution that will work not only for Ukraine and because of the Ukrainian conflict, but we will be able to address many other crimes of aggression or situations similar to this. And maybe it will be the first step towards new reality without wars.
Yeah, this should be at the center of the building of a new world order. And absolutely, we have to wrap up our panel session. Let me ask a final question to Susan Shirk. And the question is again on the relation or partnership between Russia and China. How do you see the evolution of this partnership, and how should the West look at this?
From the standpoint of Western countries in Europe and the United States, it would really be disastrous to find ourselves in another Cold War or even hot war that could potentially go nuclear between ourselves and an alliance of Russia and China. We're actually very close to that now. Russia and China, in particular Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, have a strong affinity for one another, mainly because they both feel threatened, in particular by the United States. They're focused on their zero-sum contest with the United States, which brings them closer together. They're worried about color revolutions, their own legitimacy as autocratic leaders leads them to feel quite insecure, and this brings them closer together. So it seems pretty obvious to me that an important part of the strategy of Western nations should be not to drive them closer together. And in particular, well, to give each of them, but especially China, which hasn't invaded another country, to the opportunity to restore decent relations with the West. We shouldn't make it more difficult for China to make some compromises, to negotiate issues of dispute with Europe and with the United States that might help restore some goodwill in the relationship. So some people would call this a wedge strategy. I have no problems with calling it a wedge strategy. Yes, we should design a strategy that preserves our own national security and our competitiveness by seeking not to drive China closer to Russia, but giving China a kind of off-ramp to restore better relations with the United States and with Europe.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we have to leave it there. Thanks again to Susan Shirk and Thomas Komar, Ghassan Salameh, and Oksana Pokalchuk. Thank you so much. And we're ready to move over to our next panel.